So I'm back with another episode of The Forge, where we talk about potential card changes or mechanics we'd like to see. And this week we're going to talk about just that, a new mechanic or a new ability that I think would be kind of a fun feature to add to the game. So I have been thinking about the things that exist in the game, and one of the things that has intrigued me in its use and how it works is cover. So I thought it would be cool if we introduced something that interacted a little bit more directly with cover, and I came up with the idea for ambush. Now, ambush would be an ability, so not a keyword, and that's important because keywords are important for balancing, largely due to effects like Munda Stone or Royal Sage that grant random keywords. So this would be an ability more in touch with like Summon or Last Gasp. And ambush would essentially say when a creature loses cover, a bonus effect is triggered, and then that bonus effect would be unique to each creature. So, when do creatures lose cover? Let's look at that first of all, right? Creatures can lose cover at the start of your turn, and creatures can lose cover when attacking. So that's important because if we're going to assign triggers, it would be really helpful or easy for the game if triggers already existed in those same time periods, because that means less time coding the triggers, right? If there's already like a standard, if you will, it makes it a lot easier. So the good news is that both of those scenarios already exist. We have start of your turn triggers on things like Murkwater Shaman and on Spider Lair. There's also on attack triggers that occur like Fiery Imp and Reeve Blade Master. And so in my mind, ambush would function very similar. If your creature has cover and it's attacking, it would then in the process of the attack lose cover and do its trigger or get its trigger at that moment. So like it would trigger on the attack. So why this mechanic? Why do I like it? Why do I think that it adds depth to the game? Well, I think it adds depth because the mechanic has ways that you could make it good through synergies with other cards, and it also provides some limitations in counterplay. So first we'll look at some of the synergies. Now they might be obvious, but they're worth mentioning, right? Cards like Assassin's Bow, for example, means that you could get multiple triggers. It also means that you might be able to put ambush creatures in another lane and then somehow still give it cover. The other potential synergies would be the movement cards, right? Shadow Shift, for example. You can move creatures out of the lane and then back into the shadow lane and it'll regain ambush. So ambush, while for the most part from a balancing standpoint in my mind would be viewed as you're likely to only get one trigger, it adds some depth or strategy in that you could get more than one. Now, when I think about like counterplay, right, it's lane dependent for the most part. You're going to have to play these creatures in the shadow lane to get the bonus, which means your opponent can try to play around it or do things like that. And it also means that if you really need to play your creature and get the full benefit in the field lane, that's not an option unless you have something else that then allows you to move it. So that's the counterplay portion. So it wouldn't be fun to talk about a new mechanic unless we actually talked about potential cards we'd like to see. So I went ahead and I took some of the unused data mined art that was recently released on Reddit, and I made some custom cards out of it. These are cards that if I were designing an expansion, for example, that I think would be like low-hanging fruit, easy includes, and I tried to represent like different levels of rarity, and I tried to make them stay Elder Scrolls themed. So anyway, let's take a look. The first one right here is Bosmer Assailant, right? He's a 1/3 for 2 who has an ambush of +2/+0. So when he gets the ambush, he ends up being very well statted. He'll be a 3/3 for 2, but if he doesn't get the ambush, he is only a 1/3, which is kind of, ho-hum for a 2-drop. It's important to note that he would die to execute if you don't get to trigger the ambush, right? So in that first turn, he's extra vulnerable. He's also significantly less statted if silenced, and that's kind of true of all of these ambush creatures, right? The idea would be that they would be like a negative value if you don't get the ambush off, or a negative value if they're silenced, but otherwise they're going to give you like a slightly above average value. And I think this would be a good example of just an easy common card that, you know, fits the theme and would be, you know, not overly powerful, right? So all of my examples here are not going to be like broken or OP. These are things that I think would be reasonable. So our next example is Vengeful Ghost. Vengeful Ghost is a 3-drop who has a 2/4 body, which is pretty standard stats. However, if he gets his ambush trigger, he then gets +1/+0 and lethal. So he would be a 3 for a 3/4 with a keyword. So it would put him slightly above some of the other vanilla 3/4s, or would put him kind of in line with, let's say, Withered Hand Cultist. But again, I chose to put this one as like a rare as opposed to an epic, largely because if you have to play him not in the Shadow Lane, he's not as strong as, say, Withered Hand Cultist. He's also still vulnerable to execute, just like the previous card we saw prior to the ambush. Now, he does have the option of getting bigger, right? If you do any of the lane tricks or use cards like Assassin's Bow. So he does have that he does have that benefit, but for the most part, he's like a 3/4 for 3, but he has more drawbacks than, say, you know, like I said, Withered Hand Cultist. So I felt it was appropriate to put this as a rare. I made it an endurance card just because most of the existing undead or ghost or specter cards that exist in Elder Scrolls right now fell into the endurance category, so that's why I chose to do that. And finally, we have Cicero the Mad. So some of you may remember Cicero. He's the cheeky little guy that kind of tries to turn on you, and then you have to fight through some ghosts to get to him. So to keep things in line or with that theme, Cicero is a 1/3 body, and his ambush is to summon a 4/4 Sanctuary Guardian with guard. So if you remember the quest, right, I think that flavor-wise falls right into where we would expect to see Cicero. I costed him, or I put him as a cost of 5 because stat-wise he falls right in line with Blood Dragon, who is another legendary card. Technically, you're getting a little bit more value out of Cicero in theory because of the potential to get multiple triggers. That's where like he would really shine. So on the one hand, I think he has more potential to like break out a game, but he's also A, unique, so he's not quite in line with Blood Dragon, and B, he's, again, just like the other two examples, really brittle. If he doesn't get the ambush trigger off, he's absolute junk for a 5 cost. Execute is a problem. At 1/3, he's crushing blowable, he's lightning boltable. I think that the counterplay there is strong. In fact, I would almost see a scenario where it might be worth it to bump him to a 2/4 and then just make the Sanctuary Guardian a 3/3. But I really like the idea of somebody that could be like really brittle, but then, you know, summons a quality statted creature, and you could potentially get, you know, more triggers out of it, right? So he's the guy that would be the like boom or bust scenario of, okay, how many triggers could I get out of this? And, you know, I guess in the grand scheme of things right now, he would probably look understated, but again, if you were trying to design an expansion and Ambush was going to be heavily featured, I imagine that I would include a lot of other cards that would interact with cover in some way, whether that's creatures like Wardcrafter that when they come into play grant cover to something else, or, you know, things like that. So I think that this would be fine, you know, for right now, you know, without additional context. And that concludes, you know, my example cards. So, you know, hopefully you think the mechanic is cool. Hopefully you had fun. I'd like to hear what kind of cards you would like to see with Ambush, or cards that might interact with the Ambush mechanic. And that's it for this episode of The Forge, and I will see you next time.